Capone is a very ruthless individual, a very violent individual. He came from a very poor background, realized very quickly that, the only way to get to the top was through, violence.
History often remembers the man in the fedora, the cigar clamped between his teeth, the king of a criminal empire that brought Chicago to its knees. But before the silk suits and the armored Cadillacs, there was only Alphonse. Born in 1899 to Italian immigrants in Brooklyn, Alphonse Capone was the fourth of 9 children. His parents, Gabriele and Teresa, were the embodiment of the American dream. Quiet, industrious, and law-abiding. But the streets of New York had a different curriculum. Capone was a bright student, but he had a low tolerance for the rigid, often physical discipline of the early 20th century school system. At 14, after a female teacher struck him, he struck back. He was expelled, and he never returned. This was the moment the path split. On one side, the life of a laborer. On the other, the seductive call of the 5 Points Gang. Under the wing of Johnny Torrio, the Fox, Capone learned that crime wasn't just about muscle. It was about the ledger. Torrio taught him to treat the underworld like a corporation. But Al was still young, and he was hot-headed. It was 1917 at the Harvard Inn where the world changed for Al. He made a crude remark to a girl at a table. Her brother, Frank Galusio, didn't reach for a lawyer. He reached for a knife. 3 slashes. Left cheek. Jawline. Ear. He was 20 years old, and for the rest of his life, he would be known as Scarface. A name he despised so much, he would tell people the wounds were shrapnel scars from his time in the lost battalions of World War I. He never saw a day of combat in the military. But the war for Chicago was about to begin. In 1919, the world was changing. The Great War was over. The Jazz Age was dawning, and America was about to make its greatest moral experiment, Prohibition. For a man like Johnny Torrio, Chicago wasn't just a city. It was a gold mine waiting for a pickaxe. But he needed someone he could trust, someone who wasn't afraid to get blood on a white collar. He sent for Al Capone. When Al stepped off the train in Chicago, he wasn't the king yet. He was a researcher and a bouncer at a dive called the Four Deuces. But the man running the show, Big Jim Colosimo, had a problem. He was the king of vice, but he was old school. He loved his opera, his diamonds, and his brothels. When Torrio suggested they pivot to bootlegging, Big Jim scoffed. He told Torrio that the beer business was too much heat for too little profit. It was the last mistake Big Jim would ever make. On May 11th, 1920, Colosimo walked into his cafe. He was expecting a delivery. Instead, he met a hail of lead. The shooter vanished, the police looked the other way, and just like that, the Colosimo empire belonged to Johnny Torrio, with Al Capone as his second in command. Torrio and Capone didn't just want a piece of the pie, they wanted the bakery. They organized the outfit, a criminal syndicate that operated with the precision of a Fortune 500 company. They divided the city, bribed the mayors, and put the police department on the payroll. But there was a thorn in their side, the North Side Gang. Led by Dion O'Banion, the North Siders were everything Capone wasn't. O'Banion was a florist by trade, a man who spent his mornings clipping roses and his afternoons hijacking Capone's liquor trucks. He was Irish, he was reckless, and he had a habit of laughing at the Italian boys from the South Side. The tension boiled over at the Schofield Flower Shop. On November 10, 1924, 3 men walked into O'Banion's shop. O'Banion, expecting a friendly visit, reached out his hand for a shake. One man grabbed his hand and held it tight, the death grip, preventing him from reaching the 3 guns he always kept tucked in his waistband. The other 2 men opened fire. O'Banion died among his lilies and chrysanthemums. But if Capone thought the war was over, he was wrong. He had just created a vacuum that would be filled by men even more violent. Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran. By 1925, Johnny Torrio was gone, fleeing back to Italy with a body full of scars and a mind full of ghosts. At just 26 years old, Alphonse Capone was the undisputed boss of the Chicago outfit. He wasn't just a gangster anymore, he was a celebrity. He sat ringside at boxing matches, signed autographs for fans, and famously quipped, I'm just a businessman giving the people what they want. But what the people wanted, and what Capone provided, came at a staggering price. The North Side Gang, now led by the volatile Jaime Weiss and the bitter George Bugs Moran, wanted Capone dead. The city of Chicago became a chessboard where every move was punctuated by the rattle of a Thompson submachine gun. The North Siders weren't subtle. In September 1926, they launched one of the most audacious hits in Mafia history. While Capone was eating lunch at the Hawthorne Inn, a fleet of 10 cars drove past the restaurant. They didn't just fire a few shots, they unleashed a literal wall of lead, over 1,000 rounds, into the building. Capone's bodyguard, Frankie Rio, tackled him to the floor just as the glass shattered. Miraculously, Capone walked out of the rubble without a scratch. He sat back down, finished his meal, and realized that as long as Bugs Moran breathed, the outfit was at risk. The peace conferences were over. It was time for a permanent solution. It was a Thursday morning, biting cold. A group of Moran's men gathered at a garage on North Clark Street, expecting a shipment of high-quality hijacked whiskey. What they got instead was a masterclass in deception. A black Cadillac pulled up, a car that looked exactly like a police cruiser. 4 men stepped out. 2 were dressed in full Chicago police uniforms. The gangsters inside the garage, thinking it was a routine raid, did exactly what they were told. They lined up against the brick wall, hands over their heads, waiting for the officers to process them. They never heard the sirens because there were no sirens. The officers stepped back, and the 2 men in civilian clothes produced Tommy guns from under their overcoats. 70 rounds in less than a minute. 7 men were torn apart against that cold brick wall. The killers then marched their prisoners out at gunpoint to make any witnesses think it was a successful arrest. It was a clean surgical strike. There was only one problem. Bugs Moran wasn't there. He had seen the police car, gotten spooked, and grabbed a coffee down the street instead. When Moran saw the carnage later, he told reporters, "Only Capone kills like that." The massacre was a turning point. Before, the public saw Capone as a colorful Robin Hood figure who fought the government's dry laws. Now they saw him as a butcher. The federal government, pressured by a furious President Herbert Hoover, finally moved him to the top of a new list, public enemy number 1. While Al was at his palatial estate in Florida, trying to establish an alibi, the walls in Washington, D.C. were closing in. They knew they couldn't tie him to the murders. He was too smart for that. But Capone had a weakness he didn't even know existed. He didn't believe in paying taxes on illegal income. Al Capone had survived the street wars. He had outlived O'Banion, outgunned Weiss, and broken the spirit of Bugs Moran. By 1930, he sat atop a throne made of beer barrels and blood, raking in an estimated $100 million a year, roughly $1.5 billion in today's money. He felt invincible. He walked through Chicago like a god, flanked by men who would die for him. But while Capone was looking for assassins in the shadows, he failed to notice the men in the spectacles. In Washington, D.C., the federal government was tired of being embarrassed. President Herbert Hoover gave a direct order: get Capone. The government launched a pincer movement. The first prong was flashy, designed for the newspapers. It was led by a young, ambitious prohibition agent named Eliot Ness. Ness assembled a team of agents who couldn't be bought, men with no price tag and no fear. They were dubbed the Untouchables. Ness's job was to hurt Capone's wallet. They smashed speakeasies, seized thousands of gallons of alcohol, and destroyed Capone's massive illegal breweries. Every time Ness swung a sledgehammer, it was front-page news. He was the hero the public needed, but he wasn't the man who would actually take Capone down. The second prong was invisible. It was led by a quiet, unassuming man named Frank Wilson of the IRS's intelligence unit. Wilson didn't carry a Tommy gun. He carried a magnifying glass and a mountain of ledger books. His mission was simple: prove that Al Capone was making millions and hadn't paid a single cent to the government. For years, Capone had been careful. He never held a bank account. He never signed a check. He didn't even have a house in his own name. To the legal world, Al Capone didn't exist. He was a ghost with no income. But Frank Wilson found the smoking gun in a forgotten storage room. It was a ledger seized years earlier from a gambling den called the Hawthorne Smoke Shop. In those pages, an anonymous bookkeeper had meticulously recorded the profits. Wilson spent months tracking down the man behind the handwriting. When he found him, he gave him a choice: testify against the King of Chicago or go to prison for the rest of his life. The bookkeeper chose to talk. Capone walked into the courtroom with a swagger. He wasn't worried about tax evasion. He had already spent a fortune bribing the entire jury pool. He assumed the verdict was bought and paid for before the first witness even spoke. In an instant, Capone's protection vanished. Over the next 2 weeks, the government laid out the evidence. They didn't talk about murders or the St. Valentine's Day massacre. They talked about silk shirts, custom-made furniture, and the sheer volume of cash Capone spent every day. On October 17, 1931, the verdict came in: guilty. The untouchable king was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He was stunned. As he was led away in handcuffs, he screamed at the prosecutors, but the era of the big fella was over. Al Capone thought he could handle prison. He had done a soft stint in Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary earlier in his career, where he lived like a king in a cell furnished with oriental rugs, a radio, and fine cigars. He expected the same treatment in federal prison. But the government was finished playing games. In 1934, Capone was loaded onto a specialized armored train car and shipped across the country to a brand new super prison, designed specifically for the incorrigible, Alcatraz. On the Rock, Al Capone was no longer a celebrity. He was simply inmate number 85. There were no silk robes, no newspapers, and no visitors from the outfit. The warden, James A. Johnston, made it his personal mission to break the big fellow. Capone was assigned to work in the prison laundry. The man who once dictated the politics of Chicago was now scrubbing the socks and underwear of other convicts. When he tried to use his old tactics, offering bribes or muscle, the guards simply threw him into the hole, a dark, lightless isolation cell. But something else was breaking inside Capone, something far more sinister than prison walls. Years of living a fast life in the brothels of his youth were finally catching up to him. He was suffering from neurosyphilis. The bacteria had remained dormant for a decade. But now, under the stress of Alcatraz, it began to feast on his brain. By 1938, the transformation was terrifying. The man who had orchestrated the St. Valentine's Day massacre with surgical precision began to lose his grip on reality. He would stand at attention in his cell for hours, talking to people who weren't there. He told guards he was being haunted by the ghost of James Big Jim Colosimo. Capone became the target of other inmates. He was no longer feared. He was a nut. In 1936, an inmate named James Tex Lucas stabbed Capone in the back with a pair of laundry shears. Al barely fought back. He spent the remainder of his sentence in the prison hospital, his mind regressing until he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child. In 1939, Capone was released for good behavior, though the truth was he was simply too sick to be a threat. He retreated to his mansion on Palm Island, Florida. The FBI continued to monitor him, but their reports were pitiful. They watched as the former public enemy number one spent his days wearing pajamas, sitting on his dock, and fishing in his swimming pool with a pole that had no hook. On January 25, 1947, the heart that had once beat for power finally stopped. Al Capone died of a stroke and pneumonia at the age of 48. Al Capone didn't just leave behind a body count. He left a blueprint. He showed that crime could be organized like a corporation. He exposed the cracks in the American legal system and the hypocrisy of prohibition. Today we see his face on t-shirts, in movies, and in the Scarface posters that hang in bedrooms across the world. We are fascinated by him because he represents the dark side of the American dream. The idea that you can come from nothing and own everything, as long as you're willing to pay the price in blood. The king is dead, but the outfit he built outlived him for decades. In the end, Al Capone was a man who traded his soul for a decade of power, and paid for it with an eternity of infamy. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Al Capone story, hit that like button and subscribe to Barbara Skinny TV. We're dropping the real history of the streets every week. And subscribe to Stack Season on YouTube for producing the soundtrack. We like Shaq and Kobe in the YouTube game. Let me know in the comments. That's it. That's all. Barbara Skinny, I'm out.